My name is Kirk Dunn, and this is the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. I'm an actor, writer, and knitter, and I'm also known as the Knitting Pilgrim. I earned that title because in 2003, I was awarded an Ontario Arts Council Chalmers grant to knit stitched glass, an installation of 3 large panels designed in the style of stained glass windows, which look at the commonalities and the conflicts between the 3 Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They took me 15 years to knit. And when the project was complete, my wife Claire and I wrote a play called The Knitting Pilgrim about my experience knitting stitched glass and my research into interfaith relations. One thing that wasn't covered in the play was the meaning behind the imagery in the knitted panels. So, this series explores each section in conversation because, ultimately, the project is about having conversations with empathy and curiosity about how we understand and sometimes misunderstand each other. Welcome to the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. Today, we'll be talking about a section of the Judaic window, and it's the most dominant images of the piece. It's right in the middle of the Star of David, and it is what is known as the Tetragrammaton, or the 4-letter word in Hebrew for God. And in Hebrew, these letters are all pronounced with breath sounds, which evoke the Spirit of God. And because the entire triptych is all about the one God, I felt this is a good focal point for the piece, and it's superimposed over a representation of the Talmud, which is the written commentaries and rabbinic discussions assembled and studied by scholars for thousands of years. And my hope there was just to remind us of the incredible amount of thought and consideration that has gone on and continues to go on about who or what God is. And to take us through this conversation today, we are very fortunate to have with us Rabbi Daniel Mikelberg. Rabbi Mikelberg was born in Montreal and grew up in Vancouver. And he began his studies at the University of British Columbia in science, but he changed his focus from a career in medicine to a vocation that involved healing people in a different way. And after studying at the Jewish Institute of Religion in Los Angeles, he was ordained as a rabbi in 2008, and he served congregations in Los Angeles, Kelowna, Vancouver, Toronto, and is now the rabbi at Ottawa's Reform Synagogue, Temple Israel. Rabbi Daniel is passionate about community building, tikkun olam, repairing the world, and inclusivity. And rumor has it, he is a wicked Scrabble player. So, Rabbi Daniel, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Kirk. It's a pleasure to be here and to see you virtually. And as I shared with you when we spoke the other day, when you came to visit Ottawa with your beautiful tapestries, it was one of our last programs before going virtual. It has certainly a very special moment of a brotherhood to be able to come together and to seek inspiration from your beautiful works.
Oh, thank you very much. That is a lovely thing to say. I've got to admit, I love the fact that you have a background in spirituality and science. I just wanted to put that out there. It is something I think this world really needs, that balance between those two things. And so, again, thank you for joining us today. And maybe your background in Scrabble has some bearing on my asking about this particular word. Can you tell us about the Tetragrammaton? And you never call it the Tetragrammaton. You call it, what is the Hebrew reference for this word?
So when we read the word, we generally refer to it as Adonai, which is not the phonetically sounding letters exactly, and yet it's the word that we use to represent God in our with our words. And I would say, as I answer that question, I'd actually like to take a step back and to think about the importance of names. Names are something that we take for granted. How many names do we say during a day? And yet names are so important, and they're worthy of us really reflecting on the role that each of our names play, and also the names of our loved ones, of the people who we look up to, of our friends near and far, our people who are with us, and our people who have passed on. As we think about the importance of a name carries with it reputation. It carries with it the certain values, intentions. Legacy is very important to the topic of name. And of course, identity. Some of us really love our names. Some of us, for a host of reasons, have changed our names. I share that because this topic of names is very important as we consider the Tetragrammaton, because it speaks to how we look to God and what name do we use. And forgive me, I thought particularly with this question to elaborate a little bit. I think it's important to go on a journey with the Jewish concept of God and the Jewish concept of faith, because it will connect to this concept of name. And there are two biblical stories that are quite important as we think about faith and God. Actually, there are many Jewish stories, but there are two that come to mind as I think about name. One is Abraham, and our first introduction to Abraham. This is chapter 12 of Genesis, and we don't actually know much about Abraham leading into this experience, but Abraham will receive a call to leave everything behind, and in Hebrew we say lech lecha, to go forth on a journey. It's always important to think about the context of these words. And in the ancient Near East, it would have been a time where everywhere surrounding Abraham and his family, people would have worshipped idols and would have worshipped a plurality of gods, which makes Abraham's response to God's words particularly noteworthy. As God says, Lech lecha, go forth to a land that I will show you, and you shall be a blessing. Abraham and his wife Sarah and nephew Lot drop everything and go forth. They leave the only land that they knew. They leave the family members behind, and they go on this journey, and they're not exactly clear where, and yet they have confidence that it is a place of blessing. And so we're able to witness with actually both Abraham and Sarah and Lot the ability to trust, the ability to form covenant, the ability to engage in faith, which we associate to this day with our own faith and our own connection to the eternal. And so as we think about God, entailed in our understanding of God is this mystery, in addition to this confidence, this journey, even as it is ambiguous at times. All of that would be associated with the name that I'll get to in a moment. And then we have Moses, many a generation later. And if we're now going to move actually books as well to the book of Exodus. And Moses we get to know a little bit more than Abraham. Actually, we'll have 4 books to get to know him. And in the Moses narrative, in his early years, we read that he's really disturbed by what he witnesses all around, the oppression of the Israelites, and he will eventually run away. And it is from this place of being lost, it is from the wilderness that he'll see the burning bush. Now we're in chapter 3 of Exodus, and Moses will draw near. Moses will see this bush that is aflame but is not consumed and be completely intrigued. And so again, Moses draws close. When surrounding him, no one noticed or certainly didn't draw near, and it is there that he's able to connect to the eternal and to hear God's voice. And one of Moses' early questions is, in fact, what is your name? In Judaism, we often say, what is your question, or what's the real question? Not actually sure Moses was focused here as much on the name as much as God. Who are you? What is your source of being? What role do you play in my life? Again, these are questions that are sometimes symbolized as we reflect on the concept of name. And God has a remarkable response. God responds, Yeh asher asher. I will be what I will be. And it's a reminder that God can be so much. And in fact, God will elaborate that God's presence is eternal, that God is connected not only to Moses, but to the people that walked before him, and that God is a source of blessing. And so God will be what God will be. Ihyeh asher ihyeh.
That actually, if I could just, mention one thing that what you just said there, the translation of what it was that God said to him. It's interesting in the Christian tradition, what I grew up in the Presbyterian Church. I heard that as not I will be what I will be, but I am who I am or what I am, and just that what you said, it gives that opening of the future. It's like don't try to pin me down. Whereas I found that the Christian interpretation in many cases was used as an attempt to box God in, saying God is this way and that is the way God is. So I really appreciate that you're reminding us of what the Hebrew actually means. Thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you for focusing me in on the Hebrew. If we look at the letters of the Tetragrammaton, which is Yud He Vav He, and we look to these words that were spoken to Moses from the bush, in particular the word Ihyeh, this will be. It's a reminder of this extraordinary presence, this extraordinary being and intention of God. Now, going back to Abraham, continuing with Moses, and onwards to today, as we look to God, certainly this modern Jewish sense of God, we're reminded there are no precise words, can be no images, there is no definitive understanding, and that mystery, that ambiguity is part of the unique factor and the extraordinary nature of the infinite, of the eternal being. And so inferred by these four letters is this notion of God's grandness, of God's extraordinary being, of God's infinite presence. And we're brought back to these early days, say of Abraham and Moses, but also continuing to time right to today. So forgive me for that long introduction to your simple question. And so we have these four letters, Tetragrammaton. We don't typically use that word, though. It's more for an academic setting to describe the four letters. In the Torah, in our holy text, those four letters represent God's name. Other ways that sometimes, certainly in the academic setting, that name is referred to, it can be referred to as the ineffable or the unutterable or the distinctive name, really drawing attention to this name is not like any other, that we don't treat this name like any other, that it has a truly unique being, and therefore we relate to it in different ways. And so, for example, we don't pronounce it to that name, and we don't ever read it how we would phonetically with the letters. But we also don't omit it, because to omit it would also cause problems. We don't just pretend that it's not there. So the custom is when we're reading the word to respond with the word Adonai, which is one of God's many names. Traditionally, we talk about God having 70 names. The fact is, God has many more, because no one name would be suitable. But our tradition, as we read the Torah, as we chant the Torah, is that we chant the word Adonai, which is not at all a parallel or an accurate spelling, rather more by intention. Adonai means Lord. So in the same way that when we would relate to a monarch, we would use a term of endearment and respect, even reverence. Perhaps an equivalent might be sir. As we look to the term Adonai, this is a way to note that we're relating to God, we're relating to an elevated spirit, that this term is unlike any other. Now, it's interesting to note that at its origins, the name was probably sounded out in a more authentic form as the letters or the vowels entail. But by about the 3rd century BCE, it said that we forgot how to pronounce it accurately, and that there was a fear of being inaccurate with how we read the name. And so the response was no longer to say it at all, rather than attempt to do so in a way that could cause offense, in a way that can cause pain. And so we have these four letters that really, if anything, are for us to witness, are for us to see, that represent God's being and to carry a sense of God's name.
And the other image that is part of this particular section of the tapestry is what's in behind there. And I was trying to represent a page of the Talmud. Again, it was my attempt to link the incredible amount of thought and consideration and study and effort that has gone into the experience of the one God. And can you tell us about the Talmud and what it is, how it was compiled, and I guess the way it's used in Jewish ritual today?
So in order to do that, again, I have to do a little bit of history and background, so you'll forgive me. Rabbis are not known for being succinct. so a little bit of history as to where the Talmud came from. Judaism evolved to be centered around the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. And it was centered there for about a millennia. The temple was destroyed at one point, but then shortly thereafter rebuilt. And the temple was a center for Jewish people, certainly a center religiously, also a center politically and economically. But in 70 CE, it was destroyed. And there are no terms to be able to describe the disjointed nature that it led to Jewish behavior, because they were no longer able to connect, to pray, to worship, to gather in ways that they had. And in fact, the Jewish people were sent off to exile in the year 70 CE, and from that period on would wander from home to home, really following the safety that they could find, often under precarious circumstances, really until 1948, until the establishment of the modern state of Israel. So needless to say, after the destruction of the temple, now being in exile, the Israelite, now becoming the Jewish people, needed to regroup. They needed to find their way. They desperately needed to come to understandings of their being and new understandings of how to move forward. This would have represented a tremendous vacuum, a tremendous desperation in terms of carrying forth one's traditions, but doing so in a way that related to the times. And it is in this period where we find the ancient rabbis, really the first rabbis. They would carry the mantle from the priests of the Holy Temple, and they quite creatively, strategically, thoughtfully carved out a path in what I would say is to do Jewish, to live Jewishly, but in a non-Jewish world. Meaning, in times in Jerusalem, in the Holy Land, they would have been the majority. They would have had prescribed ways to live and to practice. But now suddenly they're a minority people. They're quite lost, and they need to actually trailblaze. The Talmud is the work of these first rabbis. The Talmud very much represents the yearnings of the rabbis on behalf of their people to rebuild, to blossom, to once again find a pathway forward. It wouldn't be easy. And so the Talmud would be their written word. It was composed over about a 400-year period from the 2nd century to the 6th century. It really represents, I would almost say, the quarrels or the arguments, certainly the questions of the rabbis, recognizing the world looks very different. So how do they take their traditions? How do they take their foundational principles, their origins, and navigate a pathway forward? As we read the Talmud, it very much represents words of yearning, words of community, and related to this question, words of faith. There were deep questions of where is God in times of desperation, in times of difficulty? How do we relate to God? Do we relate to God in different ways today as we have in times past? How do we look to God as comfort, as source, as confidant? And so very much there's a connection between the name of God being superimposed on this page of Talmud, and that it really represents a continuation of this story, of this legacy, of this journey. Now, if you look to a page of Talmud, the foundational words, the earliest words, are in the middle of the page, and surrounding it are words of commentary. If we're looking to technically, the words of Mishnah are the original words. Gemara were the commentary words, and they surround. In fact, there's further commentary that also surrounds the piece, which also reminds us that even as we cherish our original words, we have a deep responsibility to continue to teach and to evolve and to pass on this Torah in different ways. And what I would say to the final note is we refer to the five books of Moses, actually, and the prophets and the writings. We refer to this as the written Torah, as in a category of literature that was canonized probably around the 3rd or 4th century BCE. And we look at that being quite fixed in its ways. We also refer to the texts that came later, in particular the Talmud, as being oral Torah, meaning we also consider it to be divine wisdom, as being holy and precious, but we recognize that it's of a different category than these other written Torah. And as we look to the oral Torah, our custom is that it would have been passed on from person to person until it was finally written in these centuries, 2nd to 6th century of the Common Era, really out of fear that if it was not written down, it would be lost. It's interesting to note the parallel questions of these different periods, how faith would have evolved, and certainly as I look to your tapestry and I continue to relate on faith today, the continuing presence of these essential questions and really these core questions of how do we relate to the divine.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you. Because I'd always wondered what it was that gave, or what the reason was behind the Talmud's very distinctive layout. So thank you for explaining that. And is there? I know that the Talmud is still studied and honored and definitely a huge part of Jewish life. Is it ever added to at all, or is it taken, as you said, has it been canonized? Has it been kept the way it is?
So, in the same way that once the written Torah would have been canonized and fixed, the Talmud as well, after say the 6th century, was looked at as being complete, as being fixed in time. But that being said, there's certainly this belief with both texts that our words of Torah continue, and that we have a responsibility to delve into the text and to comment on the text, and certainly to recognize that that our understanding, our belief, our ritual will evolve over time. There is a custom called responsa, which means there are lots of questions that we face today in the 21st century that the leaders of days past would have had no concept. Certainly, as we consider matters of technology, that's an obvious example there. And it's not uncommon, though, to look, whether it's to Torah or to Talmud, and to see what wisdom is there, but also to take that in new directions. We don't refer to that as Talmud, but we can certainly refer to that as we recognize that we pass our wisdom from generation to generation, and that which was before certainly influences that which is today. And so we certainly appreciate and value the teachings that would come today, even as they're not Torah or Talmud.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's very clear. Yeah, certainly something I was wondering about. I know that I've heard that there was a question about things like an Israeli astronaut orbiting the Earth, and for him, is there a Sabbath? And all those questions that, of course, as you said, are things that the original rabbis would have no concept of or ever have foreseen, and yet those are things that you deal with in the responsive tradition. Yeah. Thank you so much, Rabbi Daniel. This has been a very enlightening talk. I appreciate all the insight you've given us, and I wish you all the best in your life in the congregation at Temple Israel in Ottawa.
Thank you, Kirk. And one of my favorite things is the Torah comes in all shapes and forms. And as I look to your tapestries, I think it's creative Torah in that with image, you're able to truly illustrate the beauty of religion and bring people together and really lift our spirits, all the more important in this difficult time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. If you would like to follow Rabbi Mikelberg's work, you can check out the website of Temple Israel in Ottawa, and that is templeisraelottawa, all one word, .com. Or you can reach out to him directly at his email, which is rabbimikelberg@templeisrael.com. This has been an episode of the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. We'd like to thank the Ontario Arts Council for their support of this conversation series and their funding of Stitch Glass, and the Toronto Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts for their support of the Knitting Pilgrim Show. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this about interfaith matters, stitched glass, and knitting, please check out our episodes at kirkdunn.com or the Knitting Pilgrim YouTube channel.